Anna Shapiro. I'm the Chief Operating and Programs Officer at Games for Change. I'm excited. Now we are going to commence our health and well-being programming, which is sponsored by Tencent. Public conversations about gaming often focus on its challenges, but research reveals a much broader story. It shows that when approached thoughtfully, gaming can provide meaningful benefits for children and families. This keynote marks the launch of Raising Good Gamers: What Families Need to Know About Video Games and Well-Being, a new white paper from Games for Change that traces 50 years of fear-driven narratives back to their roots, reframes them, and offers a practical roadmap for families to turn gaming from a source of conflict into a source of connection. Tomorrow, we will continue the conversation with a panel about how we turn this research into practice and how you can get involved. But here to tell us more is Rachel Kowert, an esteemed researcher at the University of Cambridge and the research director at Games for Change. So please join me in welcoming Rachel.
All right. Hello. I had anxiety about being able to read this, but I totally can, so I guess I don't need to. Hi, I am Dr. Rachel Kowert, and I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about making space for engaged parenting. So, we've all been there if we're a parent. It's 9 p.m., it's a school night, a parent is standing in the doorway. You're met with the glow of a screen, only to be met with what is arguably one of the worst things a parent can hear: 5 more minutes. That's frustrating for every parent, myself included. But for many parents, that interaction, it's tapping into something deeper. It's the instigator of worry as to whether playing video games is healthy. Lots of questions and lots of fears about what video games are doing to their brains, and it's never, ever in a good way. Because when it comes to video games, the place that parents often go is one to damage. They see games as frivolous at best, instigator of all of society's problems at worst, and the reality is something much different, far more complex, which we're going to talk about today. But for many of us in this room, we also know that in those 5 minutes, your child might be coordinating strategy with people across 3 time zones. They're problem solving in real time. They're squeezing in 5 more minutes with their best friend before they have to go to bed. And that gap between what parents fear and what the research actually shows is what we're here to talk about today and what the white paper is talking about. So in 2025, FTI research analyzed over 200,000 media articles and social media posts across 15 countries and 7 languages. This is your flag test, good luck, to understand how people are actually talking about games. And what they found was surprising. First, looking at social media posts, what they found is that of all the conversations that adults are having about video games on social media, 34% were negative, 6% were positive, and 60% were neutral, which means that parents who are just perusing their social networks are 5 times more likely to encounter a negative story about games than a positive one. Now, mainstream news fared a little bit better, so good job to the journalists out there, if there's any in the room. I'm sure you're pulling up these numbers. Most of the content was neutral, but when it took a side, it trended more to positive than negative. However, fear-based articles drove significantly greater reach. So negative stories created short-term spikes that eclipsed the balanced coverage, even when positive stories are more numerous. So even when news coverage is more likely to be positive or neutral, the scary stuff is more likely to spread, just like we see with social media. So it's no wonder that parents are then jumping to this conclusion about games rooted in fear, because there's a really strong information ecosystem bias. And that's kind of kept us in the same spot that we've been for the last 50 years. This is something I show a lot. This is like how a lot of people think about games. Games plus brain equal bad. Right? And we have a conundrum, because that is not what the research shows. This is what I look like when I look at the headlines about video games, right? And I think, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? So I'm a researcher, so My first port of call is write a paper. That'll be great. It is great. So I'm proud to announce the launch today of a new white paper called Raising Good Gamers, What Families Need to Know, about video games and well-being. It is part of Raising Good Gamers, which is a Games for Change initiative that aims to foster balanced, evidence-based conversations about video games and the well-being of young people. This paper is a synthesis of decades of peer-reviewed research, and we're trying to distill and connect about what we know from the research and meeting parents where they are and distilling it in a tangible way that is understandable and relatable. Now, in this paper, it's also important to note that it is for parents, but it's really for all stakeholders here. So parents are making decisions at the dinner table, policymakers making decisions at the legislative table, designers and developers making decisions at the design table. This is really for all of them. Now, in the white paper, we also included voices from the industry, because when doing the work, it became really clear early on that parents are skeptical of games, at least partially because they see game companies as adversaries in this conversation. There are a lot of assumptions that game developers are designing for engagement at the expense of player well-being, which again, is just not the case. If you speak to leaders, these are some of the studios that are featured in the white paper, it's very clear that player well-being is central to their entire design pipeline. So we wanted to include that as well. So really the aim is twofold, to close the two gaps between parents and the research and what they assume and what they know, and also what they're thinking about in terms of how developers are approaching their craft and developing and designing for player well-being. In both cases, the worst is assumed when that is far from the evidence. So I'm gonna spend the rest of my time here today walking you through the paper to tease it, not to spoil it. There will be a QR code at the end, so you can have access to the full thing. So the paper itself has 5 sections. I'm gonna talk about the first, middle, and last for the sake of time. Panic, pivot, and partnership. If you wanna know what the other 2 P's are, you're gonna have to read the paper. So the panic is, why are we so afraid of games, and why has that lasted for 50 years? The pivot is, what does the research actually show, and how do we move past the noise? And the partnership is, what does a new relationship with games look like in practice? So we'll start with panic. First, a little bit of perspective, right? This is not the first piece of new technology that parents have been afraid of. There's a long, history of it. Novels would corrupt women's minds, and comic books would turn children into delinquents, and Elvis and D&D, they're all in there somewhere, right? There was even panic about the written word, which is my favorite part of the moral panic timeline, because Plato feared that it would destroy our memory if we started to write things down. So every generation has had a version of this story. What's different about gaming is how long it has lasted. It's lasted longer than any previous media scare in recorded history. So the question isn't really like why the panic started, it's more why is it so impossible to shake? And there are a few specific forces driving that. First, ubiquity. Games are everywhere, so they make an easy scapegoat. They also give us the illusion of control. It's a lot easier to take a controller away and feel like we're controlling something than trying to solve society's bigger problems. And also there's a negativity bias, which goes back to the research I mentioned earlier about how negative stories travel more than positive ones. As humans, we want to survive, so we pay attention to the fear stories and the negative stories more. Again, we also just love to hate whatever the young people like these days. So we continue to live in the moral panic video games era, not because of the evidence, but because of the human psychology and the broken information ecosystem. So then the next question naturally becomes, well then what does the research actually show? Time to pivot. It's the first time I've ever used this in a presentation. I'm quite proud, thank you for laughing. Okay, so this section is not about dismissing fears. Again, we spend the first third of the paper explaining why the fears are totally understandable. But this section is about reframing the primary worries that parents have, which tend to cluster around 3 primary concerns: overuse, overdependence, and overexposure. And again, given the ubiquity and the illusion of control and the biased information ecosystem, all of these fears make complete sense. They are the predictable outcome of everything we just talked about. But when we trace each concern back to the specific research underneath it, we actually do have some answers, and these are where the pivots are. So in regards to overuse, the question of time, everybody wants the magic number of time. We reframe that thinking about quality over quantity. Not how much, but what kind. Who are they playing with? Who are they gaming with? Are they getting along with their siblings? Let them play longer, which is my strategy as a parent. In terms of overdependence, it becomes a question of function, distraction versus avoidance. What role are games actually playing? Are they a source of connection? Are they a healthy distraction? Or are they now being used as a way to avoid responsibilities? Now, the tricky part is from the outside looking in, that behavior can look very similar, which is why we have to ask these questions about function. And lastly, overexposure. There are concerns about overexposure to inappropriate content. But the pivot here is moving away from only considering content. This doesn't mean content doesn't matter. It definitely does. The ESRB ratings, the PEGI ratings, they're there for a reason. We should look at them. But the social environment and the circumstances in which gaming is happening also matters. Is it developmentally appropriate is an important question to ask. The example I often give is Overcooked, which is a game that I do enjoy, makes many of my children cry. Is it age appropriate? Yes. Is it developmentally appropriate? Maybe less so for them. So each of these pivots are fully unpacked in the paper and with all the research around it to pack it up, but I'm going to leave it there for now because what I'm most excited about in the paper is the last section, which we call the partnership. 58% of kids say they want to play more games with their parents. And for children aged 5 to 7, that number rises to 73%. Most children are not shutting parents out, at least not all the time. She tells herself as a mother of 3. They're actively inviting us in. And the question isn't whether to engage, it's how. Now, I mentioned at the start of this paper, as a recovering academic, I immediately turned to we should write a paper. But as I started writing it, the mom in me was like, what we actually need is an acronym so we can remember it. Which is SPACE, making space for engaged parenting. Like the title's all coming full circle, we've reached the moment. This is the practical heart of the paper and how we actually move from conflict to conversation. So there are 5 principles, and each one will take us through panic to partnership. So show up with curiosity. We don't need to be expert gamers. We just need to be present and curious. And I mean that literally, sitting down next to your kid and saying, tell me about what you're doing. Tell me about this character. What's the best part? These questions, they open doors, and not just into the game, but into your child's life. And the example I give sometimes is if you can sit through a 5-year-old soccer game, which is like, they're not following the rules, they're picking flowers, they're doing whatever, right? If you can do that for 5 minutes, you can talk to them for 5 minutes about the game that they're playing. And for parents who feel nervous, again, we live in the era of having our world in our pocket. There's YouTube videos, there's common sense media, there's Twitch streams. You can get a sense of what they're playing before you go in and surprise them with your knowledge, which is what I do sometimes. And if showing up with curiosity is the first step, playing together is where things get really good. So one of the findings in the recent ESA report on gaming in the US found that 82% of parents report playing games with their kids. And globally, parents say that it has positively impacted their relationship, which again is not a small thing. And again, for tentative parents, if you're not good at it, it is even better, I promise you. I've told this story before, but when I first played Minecraft, I did not know creepers exploded. I wanted to make a friend, it exploded, it was very dramatic. And my kids still talk about it. They're like, Mom, you suck, you ran into a creeper. But it's the small things, it's the small things. Adjust for context. Again, I want to be very clear, when we're taking the sound bites from this talk, I'm not saying time limits don't matter. I definitely have a timer that I sit under my TV so my kids know how much time they have. But context matters more than the clock. So rather than fixating, is it 2 hours right now, or 2.5, or is it 1 or 2, ask yourself, is it okay for them to be playing right now? Is it a school night? Have they been sleeping? Are they fighting, or are they getting along? And think of it like a diet, which is the best analogy. I didn't come up with it. Amy Orban from the University of Cambridge came up with it, a digital diet. And games are just part of that food pyramid. If they're the pizza, eat the pizza. And we're in New York, eat the pizza. A marathon gaming session over a school holiday is fine. It's great. It's not a sign that there's a problem. We look at the overall pattern and the context. Cultivate digital citizenship. This is a big one. Parents won't always be in the room. And as kids get older, they'll play at friends' houses, they'll play on their phones, they'll play in spaces that you are not actively monitoring. Even if they get older and they're in the same house as you, you won't be as actively monitoring. And games can prepare them for that independence. So digital citizenship, the definition I like is the ability to engage safely, responsibly, and respectfully in digital spaces. It looks different at different ages. For younger kids, we could be teaching them about empathy and fairness and including everyone. For older kids, we can start talking about online safety and digital safety. And games are a great way to open and start that conversation. And lastly, establish boundaries together. Boundaries work best when children help shape them. They have buy-in, they're collaborative, they develop a sense of ownership over them. Doesn't mean they won't occasionally break them, but they will have a greater sense of ownership over them. So for younger children, this can include building a framework about what content is appropriate. For older children, it might be a little more complex about spending limits and time limits and that sort of thing. The boundaries should be specific to your family and your child. Come full circle. So remember that parent standing in the doorway. I want them to walk into the room, not to take the controller away, but to pick it up. I don't often share family photos in presentations. This is my family. Thank you. My babies. So this is what happens when you take controllers away. Even the baby is like, girl, what are you doing? Stop. At the time, he was throwing the controller, so you definitely take it away. But rather than it being the default, let's start opening up with show me what you're doing. And that's the shift that we're making space for, because then we get to this. And, in those 5 minutes, they're building something and they want you to see it. Like my kids all the time, they're like, look at this amazing thing I built. And they are amazing, the things that they're building in these spaces. 58% of kids say they want more of it. So this is the goals. I want to end today with a quote from one of our industry partners from the white paper, because I think it really sums up why we've spent the last year building this paper and all of the resources that go along with it. It says, games are where children are today. They're going to be a big part of the future. Even if you don't understand what or why they're playing, we have to try to understand the digital worlds that they're living in. When you start to understand it, you can help guide them. That comes from Jude Owner. She's a co-host of the Good Game Club podcast. If you don't listen to it, you should. It's great. And this is what the paper is, right? And all of the resources that we've since developed in and around it, it's the guide that parents have been looking for and not finding because the information ecosystem is working against them. Because raising good gamers does not happen through restriction, it happens through connection. And we hope this work can help you get there. So the next slide is the QR code, so you can get the paper, and thank you all for coming to listen.